Please give us climate change. I don't want to give you climate change. I can give you a description, though. Um, what's going to happen by 2050 because of climate change? Well, I'm not a meteorologist, but as I understand, the following is going to take place. We're going to see probably between 6 inches to 12 inches of rise in the sea level, which will be significant in some places and less so elsewhere. The real threat isn't necessarily the coastline being flooded. The real threat is that there are large basins of land that are below sea level, meaning that water would trickle in and essentially level hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of square miles of land uninhabitable. The reason why it would become uninhabitable is because it's not really possible to build, to construct on a water surface. It's enormously expensive. And the areas this would affect more than any other would be largely poor areas. What this would lead to, in addition to rising floods, storms, tropical hurricanes, and a bunch of other natural climate effects that will be exacerbated by climate change, is that we will see many, many millions of what we will call climate refugees. The climate refugees will be the most difficult thing to deal with because, as humans, we find humans the most difficult thing to deal with. In fact, the pain caused by the climate change itself will be almost insignificant in comparison to the social pressures that will arise from having to deal with climate refugees. Droughts will strike large portions of the equatorial regions of this planet. There will be mass storms of mosquitoes spreading malaria as the range of their birth and mating cycles expands wider and wider and wider as temperatures raise in less equatorial regions. This will cause many millions more to die of disease. Crops will die. There will be mass starvation in some parts of the world as large swaths of farmland will be impossible to irrigate. The salinization of certain inland water sources will exacerbate the rising temperatures, will increase the salinity of some of them, making it more difficult to use them for, for resource gathering. People will fight over water, undeniably. This will cause many millions more to be displaced. Water will become one of the most precious resources on the planet. We in America aren't going to be so negatively affected because we have the wealth necessary to secure stability for a time. But climate refugees are going to travel all over the planet. There may be as many as 100 million of them by 2050. That is on the higher end. It could take longer for that to develop, but there will certainly be 10 million by then. And they will move around the world looking for places that are still hospitable to human life, and in doing so, war and conflict will follow. Not because there's anything wrong with what they're doing. There's not. They deserve a land to live in. And many of the people who will become climate refugees will have their suffering caused by the countries that will deny them entry subsequently. But we won't let them in. We, Western Europe, China, will severely restrict the influx of climate refugees from poorer countries, which will probably lead to wars at the border and will possibly lead to a culling of those countries in an effort to try to stem the flow of economic and climate migrants. Fascism will rise, as will ethno-nationalism, as people will turn towards extreme forms of xenophobia to politically justify their political behavior. I've heard this before, but nobody has ever offered any solutions. Do you have solutions? You could die of natural causes before 2050 if you like. No, unfortunately at this point, it seems like most of the worst of what's going to happen is pretty much set in stone. Even if we enacted some ludicrously effective climate change program, like a whole world, it wouldn't be enough to prevent much of what I have described from happening. What we can do at this point is set the groundwork to make sure that civilization can rebuild itself after this incredibly difficult period. There's probably going to be a period of a couple hundred years where there's a large swath of the earth that's made uninhabitable to human life, at least not without a significant investiture of resources. I don't think there's any way to stop that, but we can minimize the growth. I mean, we want it to be the equatorial belt, not the equatorial belt and the temperate regions above and below. Way too close to an eco-fash take? What? Have I made any prescriptive statements? Do you think I like any of the things I'm describing? This is what's going to happen. It's our responsibility to mitigate the damage once it does. Well, anyway, there's going to be a lot of bad stuff. No getting around that. Um, there are things we can do to mitigate that terror, though. There are things that can be done. So there are some pretty simple, common sense policies that could be proposed and developed to mitigate the damage here. So the first of which is in the coming few decades, we need a mass construction of refugee cities in the developed world. That's going to be pretty much number one. When millions of people need to move into these countries, we need to be ready for them for a number of reasons. First of all, it would prevent a genocide. That would be nice. Second of all, it means that the wealth, resources, and labor value of the flooded world will not be cast off into the abyss, but will rather be put to use rebuilding humanity and making the Earth habitable again. We need as many people as we can to solve these problems. We also need significant investments in both genetically modified crops and into legal reforms to allow those crops to be readily accessible to people around the world. Without genetically modified organisms, it will not be possible for us to feed all of humanity with the relatively sparse area we'll have available for farming. We will need to invest heavily in desalinization machinery. I'm not that familiar with what kinds of technology will be necessary for that, but it's something we're going to need to invest in for goddamn sure. And there was a Kurzgesagt video, love to talk about Kurzgesagt, on, what was it called? Was it ecological terraforming? What was it called? It was seeding the, what was it called? It was a recent video. It was about ways to modify terragenesis. Is that the term? Terragenesis? Essentially, the premise was this. One of the things we need to do is we need to cool the planet down fast. Green energy isn't going to do that fast enough. We need to block out the sun. And one of the best ways we could do that is with technology that we actually already have. We can seed the clouds to increase their ability to protect us from UV radiation. This would significantly decrease the amount of energy that makes it into Earth's atmosphere. It would bounce back into space, where it can't hurt us. Now, we could do that. It seems like we have the technology to do that. It would decrease the temperature of the Earth by a couple of degrees Fahrenheit very quickly, within a couple of years, if done appropriately. This is something we've done before. When we were fighting in, I believe, Vietnam, we actually seeded the clouds such as to extend the monsoon season for one more month. The monsoons, once extended, further decimated the supply lines of the Viet Cong, preventing them from moving troops and resources effectively across the breadth of their country. We did that back in the 1960s. Nowadays, that would be considered a war crime, or a crime against humanity, one or the other. UN contracts prevent the modification of weather for warfare. We're no longer allowed to do that. But it's something we have the technology to do. If we did it on a global scale, we would be capable of reducing the temperature of the Earth temporarily. We would still have the same amount of carbon in the air, which means that if we ever got rid of the cloud seeding, it would go right back to where we were. We'd have the same problems as before. But it would give us some time to fix the problem, certainly. So that's a potential solution. How would we grow crops? We're not talking about, we're not talking about like the Matrix, like blocking out the sun forever. We're just talking about increasing the density of particulates in the atmosphere that reflect electromagnetic radiation. We would only need to reflect a fraction of a percentage of the amount that reaches Earth to reduce the temperature. Clouds make it hotter. I think we're missing something here. So the way climate change works, put simply, we're going to do a little bit of a diagram, okay? So here's the way climate change works, put very, very simply, okay? So the reason Earth has any heat in its surface at all is because of electromagnetic radiation from the sun. Let's do a little drawing right here. Now, there is heat inside the Earth that is not dependent on the sun. That's the surface. See, it's like a curve, okay? There is heat generated from the core of the Earth. The molten core of iron, or is it iron? The core at the center of the Earth. generates heat and will continue to do so for hundreds of millions of years, which is lovely. You know, that's the thing. However, the surface of the Earth, the place where we live, the energy up here is pretty much entirely from the sun, where we get our little electromagnetic radiation. Woo! Okay? Now, the electromagnetic radiation from the sun is deadly to living things, including us. That's why space probes, satellites, and the ISS are all shielded from radiation. A human being unshielded in space would die relatively quickly, unprotected from radiation. Thankfully, we do not live in outer space. We live behind an atmosphere. The atmosphere, along with the projection of electromagnetic energy from the core of our planet, provides a little bit of a barrier. When electromagnetic radiation arrives, sometimes it bounces off. Pew! Shh, pew! Like this, shh, pew! Ooh. Now, of course, that's not every electromagnetic ray. Quite a bit of it makes it to the surface. And when it makes it to the surface, it heats the planet up. In reality, there are many more processes by which this energy can be absorbed or reflected. But this is the gist of it. The goal of geoengineering in this case would be to seed the upper atmosphere and the upper cloud line, I mean, that it would be contained in clouds mostly, with particulates that would aid in the reflection of electromagnetic rays. After all, an electromagnetic ray is, I mean, infrared radiation, light, visible light spectrum. It can be reflected rather easily with a great many chemicals and substances that we're already aware of. I mean, you hold a mirror up and you reflect the light, don't you? It's really just a matter of making sure that it's distributed in the right amounts and all over the place. There you go. That's what would happen. But it wouldn't block out the sun. When I said that, I was being a little bit hyperbolic. You know. Yes, Dino, that's the case. It wouldn't be a solution. It would only give us more time to arrive at a solution. Anyway, there are things that could be done. It would be the equivalent of a volcanic eruption. Yeah. When the Krakatoa volcano erupted, effect on Earth temperature. When the Krakatoa... Yeah, here we go. Look at this. See? These principles work. When the Krakatoa volcano exploded in 1883, there was a lasting effect on the world's climate. Aerosols emitted into the atmosphere by the blast led global air temperatures to drop by as much as 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit. This on its own, another Krakatoa, would be enough to single-handedly compensate for a significant portion of the effects of climate change. Now, of course, we don't want to do it via a gigantic explosion. That's not an ideal way of handling that. You know. We just have to wait for Yellowstone, yeah. Once Yellowstone pops, we'll be fine. Yeah, we'll see. Yellowstone makes me nervous. It's just if Yellowstone goes, man, it's gonna that's gonna be a big one. That's what that's gonna be. Yikes. Yeah. Yeah, bye-bye, North America. Bye-bye a quarter of the Pacific plate. Yeah. Anyway, let's talk a little bit less about the science, because I'm not a scientist. Sociologically, the climate change is going to fuck us pretty hard. There's no getting around that, and we're going to live through some pretty difficult times. Even if it weren't for political instability, just the science of climate change on its own, just the factual, inevitable effects it's going to have in the world, are going to be extremely detrimental to human life. But if we handle things perfectly, well, we can mitigate it a little bit, you know, somewhat. And I'm optimistic about the potential for that to take place, because humanity does have a way of pulling through in times of crisis. It sounds a little bit cheesy, and I don't think we're going to do perfectly, but we are fairly adaptable. And I'm reminded of, first and foremost, the genius and the ingenuity of wartime scientists. That's what I tend to think about, you know? Generally speaking, it seems like scientific advancements are exacerbated by a tremendous sense of urgency and a delegation of national funding. And Right now, it's hard to get people to care about climate change because it's still this vague future thing, even though we feel the effects right now. Every year we set new highs in temperature around the world. But um, during wartime, we really kick it into top gear. All the technologies that were invented just during World War II, for example. Yeah, sonar. I mean, God, like this, there's so much incredible work, so much ingenuity put in just a few years that has the effects of which have reverberated across time. We know so much more now because genius people were told in no uncertain terms that the world depended on their ingenuity. And that makes a big difference. Now, I think that America, I think the world at large, is full of people with some very bright ideas. I think what all they need is the resources and the money. And I think with that, we can at least mitigate. We can at least address. It's my hope. Hopefully that's something we can look forward to. Even the COVID vaccine. I mean, with the mRNA process that has only recently come to be broadly accepted and used, we were able to get a vaccine out in just a year. I mean, that's extraordinary. That's not to say I don't have problems with how all this was handled, particularly distribution and IP law, but we just getting a vaccine, I mean, within a year, like that's unprecedented. It's, you know, it's extraordinary. So there is some optimism to be found. Yeah. I worked on mRNA targeting in college. Thank you for your service. Do you feel like you saved the lives of the millions who would have died otherwise from COVID? Like you personally? You should. "100% all me." Goddamn right. Anyway, you all get what I'm saying, right? I'm sure you do. We will be remembered by our children as makers of something worse than the Holocaust, unironically. Well, hold on. You guys aren't at fault. The people who should be tried at The Hague are all the politicians and corporate leaders who conspired to minimize and downplay the extent of climate change since the 1960s. Those people will be remembered as history's greatest monsters. I say that without exaggeration, that Hitler has nothing on them. Billions of people are going to die, undeniably, over the course of the next few centuries. Mathematically, they are the greatest architects of human misery to have ever existed. They will be remembered in infamy for as long as humanity continues to exist. There will be effigies of them burnt as national holidays in every country on Earth, once we truly come to reckon with the damage they've done to the world. Like, yeah, nothing even comes close. It's extraordinary, really, but don't the general public have some responsibility? There's an extent to which you can levy blame at some portions of the general public, but as a general rule, I think it's important to recognize that broad social trends like this have people who follow what they're told and people who tell. And I think it's very important to distinguish between people who benefited from and deliberately orchestrated lies and deceit and misinformation and propaganda specifically designed to keep people from being aware of climate change, to minimize it, to downplay it, and the people who fell in line, the people who followed along with it. If there is some like 76-year-old boomer out in Michigan who doesn't believe climate change is real and drives a gas-guzzling Hummer because their politicians and all their favorite pundits told them so, is that person at fault for contributing? I mean, yeah, sure, and I think it's shitty of them to do, but they're not history's greatest monster. They're not the cause of the problem. They're a molecule being pulled by the wake of a boat. They're a tiny part of a larger current where there is an agent directing that current, or a collection of agents, people in the hundreds, maybe even in the dozens, broadly, responsible for the death of billions in the future. Who causes the wave? Each individual molecule in the wave, sure, possibly, but those who left the wake are the greatest monsters. Okay, we've doomered enough. Are we... I'm dooming and now I don't want children? Well, where's the safest place to move to for this? if you want to be safe for climate change, you need to live in A, a wealthy country, and B, either inland or on a hill. I mean, you want to live in areas where the weather isn't that affected by coastal weather, like storms and what have you. Also, you'll need kids to help you farm after the collapse of civilization. You don't want to live in Florida. That is for goddamn sure. You do not want to live in Florida. Florida is going whoop, right underwater. Blue Florida. Blue Florida. But I want to be a sea creature? Then move to Innsmouth. All right. Move to Venice, yeah. Well, Venice is already underwater. Actually, the rising sea level has actually done quite a bit of damage to Venice, if I remember correctly. It's actually led to a pretty significant increase in the damage there. And we need to totally destroy the suburbs. Yes, we need to engage in more efficient urban planning, 100%. Would anyone want to live there in the first place? I don't know. I've heard Miami is kind of cool. I've never been to Miami. I've only ever been to the suburbs of Florida, where my grandparents lived.